So, without any buildup, the big, beautiful bill passed since we last spoke. And that is what I'm going to concentrate on today, but I'm going to try to put it in a broader context. And so I want to talk about it in terms of what I'm going to call the era of presidential supremacy. And so I'm back to my diagram of Congress going up in flames, right? And the constitutional structure of the United States really not working. And what I'm going to focus on is, in part, the fact that this is a bill that really does not emerge from concerted and protracted congressional deliberation. This is a monstrosity of a bill, right? It contains so many different provisions that it really makes it difficult for the public to understand everything that's in the bill, certainly to subject the different aspects of the bill to what we sometimes refer to as mature deliberation. That is to say, do we like this? Do we like that? Are there trade-offs in this bill that we would not make if we had time to consider them? And that as opposed to a series of bills in which each of the significant provisions of this bill were subject to not only congressional scrutiny, right? And Congress has committees and subcommittees, and they can call experts and they can call hearings, and the hearings can, among other things, not just solicit greater information about the different provisions of proposed legislation, but also direct public opinion, public attention, get us to pay attention to what is at stake in a piece of legislation passing. And so we know our government is built on what recent political scientist Jane Mansbridge calls the resistance principle. It's supposed to be hard to legislate. And part of the reason it's supposed to be hard to legislate is precisely because you want, in a democracy, the people to have the time to understand the provisions of legislation that is being proposed in their name. To be able to give their representatives feedback requires that they have the opportunity to consent or dissent, and that means that they have to actually be able to understand, focus, debate, deliberate on the contents of a bill. And when we have a bill that is this large, has this many different components to it, does this many things simultaneously, not only is it impossible for the public to simultaneously digest all of its contents, and of course it occurs in the midst of a broader strategy that I think Steve Bannon has correctly and aptly labeled the flood the zone strategy. Just overwhelm the public, overwhelm the political process, overwhelm the courts, overwhelm the legislature with so much action on so many different fronts that things will get passed not because they're supported, but because they're not noticed, or because insufficient political attention is directed to them, because frankly there's just too much happening all at the same time. So this is not Congress operating the way it's supposed to operate, and as opposed, of course, to Congress being burned down, in a sense, Congress is simply vacating its constitutional responsibility to slow down the legislative process. And the reason that it's doing this is because Donald Trump wants Congress to enact his agenda, and to do so quickly, precisely so that resistance can't build up to it. And here, just very quickly, to think through, right, the progression in American politics, take us back to, right, the early 1990s, when Bill Clinton was proposing significant reform to the system via which medical insurance is provided and funded in the United States. And if you remember, that debate took over a year, right? And it was on a, relative to this legislation, relatively narrow issue. And there were multiple subcommittees of Congress and multiple back and forths between the president and Congress on the content of that bill. And the result was that the bill was considerably reformed by Congress before it was ultimately voted on. But in addition to that, right, the result was that the medical insurance industry, the pharmaceutical industry had enough time to spend millions of dollars running ads to build up resistance to the legislation. And so right in the 20th century and the 21st century, the slow, deliberative resistance institutions in particular in our legislature, as opposed to fostering mature deliberation, seem to foster inaction. There are, as we've talked about, so many veto points in our legislative process that it's very easy to kill legislation. If you want to get something big and ambitious done, maybe the strategy that Donald Trump has adopted suggests you need to do a whole lot at the same time very quickly before any particular constituency can build the resources, the network, the resistance, the opposition to defeat your legislation. And so I'm going to speak in detail about the content of the big beautiful bill and what it's going to do to our society. But I want also to frame the final issue in my title before we do that, and that is, in essence, will the Republicans pay a price? And I think that the Democrats, in certain respects, while not in any way happy about the consequences of this bill, which I think on principle the Democrats believe will be catastrophic for our country and for the people who they care about, for the poor, for the people who rely on government to supplement their ability to make ends meet, to afford health insurance, to afford food, to afford higher education, in addition to being a complete disaster for climate change, right? So in all of these regards, this legislation is not something that the Democrats want or agree with. And on the other hand, I do think the Democrats believe that this may allow them to claw back power in 2026 and 2028. The Democrats are badly fractured right now, and they are essentially leaderless. And that's not just because they ran a bad candidate in 2024. It's because they're a complex coalition. They're having a hard time holding their coalition together. And because, in certain respects, public opinion has turned against some of their priorities, the result is that the Democrats need to be able to furnish some kind of unity. A kind of negative unity may be the best they can do. Opposing the big beautiful bill may provide them that unity going into the 2026 midterm elections. But here is the question. Will the Republicans actually pay a price for having passed deeply unpopular and ultimately destructive legislation? And here I want to issue a word of caution against those who see that kind of silver lining in this legislation. And I'm not going to rely merely on the technical point, which is that many of the worst provisions of this bill don't go into effect until 2026 or 2027, in the hopes that the Republicans will not have to pay a price in the near future for their unpopular legislation, or that the one of the truly problematic features of this bill is the way in which it increases the deficit and pushes the country closer and closer to the brink of lack of confidence in our capacity to repay our debt, which, of course, if we reach that point, will have really profound consequences for our government's capacity to provide the range of services that we currently take for granted. That too is not going to happen, I don't think, next year or the year after. And so it is the case that there are features of this legislation, there's a gambit that the American people won't punish the Republicans in time for it to matter for the short-term success of Donald Trump. Frankly, part of the problem of the president or a presidential era in American politics in which presidents do more of the work of setting the legislative priority of the nation is that presidents often operate on a shorter term time horizon than do members of Congress. Maybe all that matters to Donald Trump is that he get his legislation in and that he has a good few years of success as a result. But members of Congress will eventually have to pay the cost, is the standard way of thinking about this, unless policy matters less than identity in the 21st century in American politics. And here I'm going to get into the logic of what appears to be materially self-injuring politics, right? The Republicans won the vote of Americans who make $50,000 a year or less, and what they did to reward them was to pass a bill. 95% of the tax break benefits go to the top 5%, right? It is the most regressive piece of legislation in American history. And it is also the case that those tax cuts are partially subsidized by taking benefits away precisely from the people who make $50,000 a year or less. Won't those people ultimately come back home to the Democratic Party? And here I want to offer a word of caution. I'm not sure they will. I think it may be the case that we have entered what some political scientists refer to as a post-material period in politics, where people are not voting on the basis of their material interests, they're voting on the basis of their identity. And there are reasons that Donald Trump is drawing the support of the people whose interests he's attacking, and they don't have to do with the fact that they think he's going to increase or protect Medicaid or supplemental nutrition assistance programs. They have to do with deeper reasons of identification and of the way in which they think Donald Trump is acting on their behalf, not to benefit them through government policy, but to restore their pride, their dignity, their status, their standing in this society. And I'm not sure this legislation damages that, or that the Democrats regain their capacity to say to their, right, what used to be their voters, the voters who Donald Trump has taken away, this is why you should vote for us. So let's get into this, starting with the legislation itself. This is an updated diagram. It hasn't changed that much, but to give you just an x-ray of an enormously complex bill, and I cannot go into all the details. There are various websites that have tried to provide a comprehensive list of all of the details in this legislation, and they're, dozens of pages long, too much for me to share with you. But clearly, right, the primary cost of this bill is the tax cuts that were in the original Tax Cut and Job Creation bill that Donald Trump and the Republicans passed in 2017, making them permanent, right? And please note, right, that the Republicans, Donald Trump, are engaged in funny math when they say that, well, these don't really add to the deficit because they were already tax cuts. That's just not true, right? If they would have expired next year, our deficit would have gone down. Making them permanent increases the deficit, and to the tune of roughly $5 trillion. And remember, 95% of this tax benefit accrues to the top 5% of our population. It's hugely regressive. So there are offsetting savings or cuts in this bill. The most important is $1 trillion taken out of Medicaid. We'll get into this in a few minutes. It's not always direct cuts. It's cuts that will go into effect because it will be much more difficult for people to do the paperwork to qualify for Medicaid. So many people who are in fact qualified will no longer get Medicaid because it will be too difficult for them to meet the onerous requirements, and also cuts to states that will then result in cuts to benefits. The green energy and environment provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. And I didn't start there, maybe I should. We are obviously watching in horror as the Guadalupe River has flooded, has escaped its bounds, has swept over young girls' camp in Texas, and there are scores of people dead, right? And I just want to be as clear as possible. This is exactly what people who are worried about climate change, greenhouse gases, more extreme weather have been warning about. This is exactly what the Inflation Reduction Act was designed to address, and this will be eliminated by this bill, right? And again, this will be worse for the people who voted for Donald Trump, but this is awful for all of us and for the future of civilization and biological life on the planet. I don't think I'm overstating it when I say that the United States is making a huge mistake, and one that may be costly not only to our own citizens, but to everyone on the planet. Reducing student loans, and so reducing the affordability of higher education in a knowledge economy, reducing food care, reducing Obamacare subsidies and other forms of eligibility that will reduce the amount that is spent on the Affordable Care Act. You put all of this together, and it offsets about $2 trillion of the $5 trillion in tax cuts. But the result is that we will still have a substantial increase in our deficit caused by this bill. And by the way, there's a report from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, right, a relatively conservative budget hawk organization that looks at the White House Council of Economic Advisors projection and calls it fantastical, right? You know, you can see the Tax Foundation, the Penn Wharton model, the Yale budget model, the Congressional Budget Office all think that there will be some short-term increases in economic growth. Please note that a lot of these organizations think that this may actually cause long-term economic slowdowns or no long-term benefit to economic growth. And the reason, right, that the Congressional Budget Office says in the long term, the growth that this bill causes, and it does think that it will cause a negligible amount of further growth, will not actually draw down the deficit. The reason is because the negligible amount of additional growth is more than offset by the increase in interest rate that running an extra $3 trillion worth of debt will cause. And so, to be as clear as possible, we got new job numbers out last week, right? The economy continues to add jobs. Our rate of economic growth is among the highest in the developed world. Our economy is doing reasonably well. We don't need further stimulus in 2025. And so the idea that somehow this bill is going to cause additional economic growth seems incredibly suspect, right? And so fantastical in the way that it's being expressed. But the idea that it will actually increase our deficit substantially, I think is unavoidable, right? This is the largest deficit spending bill that has passed Congress in a very long time. And that includes, right, the American Rescue Plan Act, which was deliberately designed to be a deficit spending bill to stimulate us in the middle of a recession, the COVID recession, right? Please note that the Biden bills on infrastructure and on inflation reduction mainly paid for themselves, right? Whereas, right, the Trump Tax Cut and Jobs Act added 1.5 trillion to the deficit. This bill may add $3-4 trillion to the deficit. And at a point where we have a structural deficit and where our interest rate cost, our cost of paying down the debt with its interest, is eating up more and more of the federal deficit. And so what you notice when you look at this is that we are a debt state, right? That is to say, the United States federal government cannot meet its obligations in terms of the services it provides on the basis of the revenue it collects. It depends systematically on going into debt. And we also know that there are scenarios in which governments can run debts for a long time without jeopardizing either the capacity of the government to go into debt, pay down that debt, or the overall economy as a result of contracting the money supply. But frankly, when we look at, and let me make sure I've got this here, yes, the what this is going to do to our debt to income ratio, right? And so in 2025, our debt is essentially equivalent to 100% of our annual economic product. As a result of this bill, it will go up to 125%. I don't think that there's some magical place where this becomes unsustainable. As opposed to that, I think the people who look at this, especially when you look at the fact that roughly a third of this is funded by foreign, right, investors and governments, they are doing this because they believe that the treasury bonds that the US government issues are a good, safe asset. If they begin to have a different answer to these two questions, does the government have serious leadership that really is committed to the good faith and credit of the United States? And here I come back to the flaws in the policy-making process in the United States that this bill exemplifies, right? The idea that essentially Congress didn't do its job. It didn't unpack the components of this bill. It didn't have serious hearings, call experts, allow for public opinion to coalesce on each of the issues. No, it rammed this through as one giant omnibus reconciliation bill. That's not the way a serious country actually makes law. And so if the flaws in our legislative and governmental process are such that they undermine confidence in the leadership, in the rationality, in the responsibility of American government, then foreign governments are going to be much less willing to finance a ever skyrocketing level of debt. And then the second question, does the government have the capacity to repay the debt, right? That's the in a sense maybe the primary question, but in our circumstance, I think the question of whether we're serious about actually addressing our long-term fiscal needs is at the fore of international skepticism about the direction the United States is taking. But the capacity question isn't just, is the economy big enough to bear the burden of repaying the debt? I think we are in a position where ultimately we could, and if you go back here, right, you can see, right, under Bill Clinton, right, when we got serious about repaying the debt, we did repay the debt, right? There was a capacity to cut services, increase taxes in a way that could get us back into the green, or the black, I guess I should say. But if we substantially reduce the staff at the Internal Revenue Service, if we undermine our capacity to go after the most important sources of revenue, the biggest earners and the largest corporations that are engaging in gimmicks or simply violating the law by parking their assets offshore, then we may in fact lack the capacity to enforce the tax collection that we need. And of course, Doge just undercut the Internal Revenue Service. So look out for a sovereign debt crisis. And what a sovereign debt crisis does to us is it takes us out of being a debt state and into a consolidation state. And so I want to say that one of the most significant consequences of this bill's passage may be a deferred austerity crisis of the kind you saw, for instance, in Greece a decade ago, where essentially the international financial community says to the United States, if you don't want to default on your debt, if you want to continue to be able to issue debt, you're going to have to substantially scale back the services your government provides. And that is deeply unpopular. There's no chance that the Republicans can get that through Congress directly, but this is a measure to indirectly force us to do that in the near future. So the idea, give me 1 second, there's some noise in the background. In the middle of a lecture. Okay. So sorry about that. I just had some background noise. I had to get quieted down. The idea that a second aspect of this bill that I think is genuinely awful is the acceleration of growing inequality, right? And I'm going to measure this in a few different ways. I'll just start with a simple measure of inequality, right? In the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, our inequality had been substantially reduced by New Deal programs, beginning with the neoliberal era, the policies put in place by Ronald Reagan and then accelerated not only by Republicans, but also by Bill Clinton, right? We see a rapid rise in the inequality in the United States. Please note it actually came down during the Biden years as a result, in particular, of the aggressive COVID measures, and I suspect it's already going back up, though we don't have the data on it yet. But look at what this bill does, right? We're already at a much higher level of inequality than we have had in our recent history in and of itself, right? And here you look at the changes in taxes versus the changes in the reduction of benefits, and then you get a net figure. The bottom 20% of families are going to lose about 2 to 2.5% of their income and transfers, right? The top 20% are going to gain about 2.3%. It is an exact transfer from the poorest to the richest families. We can go in a little bit more detail, right? Starting first just with kind of, right, the bottom 10%, the top 10%, and you can see it's more extreme at the further down the income distribution you get. And then if you add to this, right, what the tariff increase are going to do to the cost of goods and the share of disposable income that non-discretionary expenditure impacted by the tariffs is at the bottom 10% as opposed to the top 10%, you see that these right actions, the big beautiful bill and the tariffs combined, are going to make us a much more unequal society at a moment when we already are a profoundly unequal society. We've looked at this together before, the Penn-Wharton model, which says not only does this bill, right, redistribute from the bottom 20% who are entirely in red to the top 20%, it also redistributes from the people who are older today to the people who haven't yet been born, which is to say, from the future to the present. In both these regards, this bill is a just textbook case of using government in a kind of reverse Robin Hood way to take from those who least afford the ability to have their income reduced in order to give to those who least need it. All right, so I want to spend more time in particular on the Medicaid cuts. And so I'm going to provide a fair bit of information here today. I'm going to start with the reason that there are large Medicaid cuts in this bill, and then look into the impact in greater detail. So the reason that there are large Medicaid cuts in this bill, frankly, is because the non-discretionary, right, spending, the spending on interest and national debt, are not on the chopping block, right? They can't possibly be reduced because defense spending was basically taken off the agenda. What was left was Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare. And Trump had promised, and I think appropriately, that he wouldn't go after Medicare or Social Security. This actually differentiates Donald Trump from earlier generations of Republicans who wanted to do so-called entitlement reforms. Donald Trump is a populist, at least when he's running for office or when he's speaking to the press. But it turns out when it comes to making these tax cuts, which are not at all populist, highly regressive, permanent, he's willing to do things that are very bad for the people who vote for him, but he's not going to attack Social Security. He's not going to attack Medicare. So what's left is Medicaid. And just to make it as clear as possible, right, the number of people on Medicaid, let me just get the right diagram, I'm sorry, has grown substantially since Obamacare. It's gone from 14% to over 20% of the population. 1 in 5 Americans is on Medicaid. And then we notice, right, that Medicaid is actually bringing health care costs down substantially relative to private health insurance for the people who qualify for it, right? It's on average about 20% less expensive. To be as clear as possible, that doesn't make Medicaid free, right? And that the people who are going to be damaged by the Medicaid cuts in this bill, right, depending upon whose analysis you use, 12 to 17 million people are going to lose Medicaid and Obamacare coverage, right? And they're distributed primarily in our poorer states, although California and New York, which are relatively generous in how they calculate qualifications for Medicaid, have higher numbers of Medicaid. Mainly it's in our poorer states. And what this is going to do, right? And I just want to be as clear as possible. Really, we have never enacted legislation that substantially increases the number and the percentage of Americans who don't have health insurance. But this policy will dramatically increase the number and the percentage of Americans without healthcare insurance. It will do so by imposing work requirements, by making it more difficult for states to fund Medicaid, especially, and I won't go into the details here, but the way in which a tax reimbursement loophole used by 49 out of 50 states is being removed. It repeals rules simplifying eligibility requirements. It checks on eligibility more frequently. It limits payments to providers. And you put all of this together. I need to be as clear as possible about this. How do you save money on Medicaid? You save money by not providing health care to people who have conditions that require health care, right? You don't provide chemotherapy to people with cancer. You don't provide dialysis to people with diabetes or kidney failure. You don't provide pain medication to people with injuries, right? And so the consequence of this is going to be both increased suffering, decreased life expectancy, and also exacerbated health inequality and overall inequality. To be as clear as possible, what will happen here is some people will forego care, and that will shorten their lifespans, decrease their quality of life. Some people will bear the expense themselves, and that will decrease their disposable income and make them poorer. And some people will go to the hospital or be taken to the hospital and receive care and be unable to afford it. To pay their medical debt. And that means that cost will be shifted onto the hospitals, the insurance companies, the clinics, the medical care system. And again, the prediction here is very clear that clinics and hospitals are going to close in poorer states because ultimately they're going to be saddled with more people who cannot afford to pay their health bills, and they are going to lose their capacity, the hospitals and the clinics, to pay their own bills. So I think this is important to see. When you listen to Republicans talking about this bill, they say, well, what they really want to do is to make able-bodied people who should be working get off their couches and go to work to afford healthcare insurance, right? That's a very small percentage of the overall Medicaid expenditures, right? The vast majority of people who are on Medicaid are children, are retired, or are working, right? And it's clear that everybody who analyzes this bill suggests that the bill is not going to save money because young, healthy people are going to be kicked off Medicaid. Note, if they're healthy, they're not really using substantial benefits to begin with. What's going to happen is that people who are working and working 2 or 3 jobs, because this economy very often requires that that's what you do to meet the affordability gap, are going to not have the time, not have the organization, not have the wherewithal to meet the much more demanding qualification requirements, the onerous burdens of new paperwork, what is sometimes called a time tax. These are not people with the time to fill out all the paperwork, or with the education, or with the organization, with the skills to do so. And so they're going to be kicked off of Medicaid even though they qualify, even though they're working full time or more. And I just think that we have to be honest about the priorities here. And then to put this in the context of health inequality, right? Fortunately, this is the data on the deaths of despair, so called. This seems to be a little bit better than it was in 2020, in part because of some advances in medication for opioid overdoses, right? But the idea that there is a real crisis in life expectancy of especially white people with less than a college education, right? And here I now need to start getting into the broader argument of my overall analysis. So this data is really borne out here, that this is race specific, this is not race specific, it's just focused on income. But what you can see, right, is if you are a woman, right? I'm sorry, this is men. Let's start with men. A man who was born in 1960, and you're in the highest income bracket, the top 20%, you are going to live almost 10 years longer than a man born in 1930. But if you're in the lowest income bracket, bottom 20%, your life expectancy is actually going to be shorter. It's even more pronounced for women. And so how can this be, right? That with all of these advances in medicine that we have, people are actually losing life expectancy based on class, based on being in the bottom 20% or the bottom 40%, as I guess you can probably see from the diagrams. And I think that the answer is complicated, but part of it is that the people in the bottom 20 or 40% just don't have access to the medical care that the people in the top 20 or 40% do. But it's more than that. And that's why the deaths of despair literature is so important. It's also the way in which loss of security and status undermines health and well-being. We've talked about this together before, but when you experience high levels of stress in your life, I don't know if I can pay my rent. I don't know if I can feed my child. I don't know if I can fix my car and afford my wife's medical bills at the same time. That is unhealthy, right? And it's not just psychologically unhealthy. We understand better and better it is physically unhealthy. It causes the body to increase cortisol production, and that is a major pathogen. And if you have chronic stress, if you're constantly feeling forms of economic stress and your body is constantly producing the stress hormones, especially cortisol, it can really degrade your health over the long term. And so you add to that a different kind of stress. I started with economic stress, now add social evaluative stress. Do people respect me? Do people actually think that I belong in the same room as them? Are they looking down at me? Do they not care about me? Are they really thinking that I'm not included in or fully equal in this society? That also creates a great kind, a very important kind of stress, social evaluative stress. And one of the things we know is that as societies become more unequal, the status differences between people grow, and social evaluative threat becomes more pronounced. And again, it seems that the best explanation of this genuinely perplexing data, right? How can it be that people are living less long who are born later after all of these evolutions and advances in medicine? I think social evaluative stress has a lot to do with it. And there's a robust public health research literature that bears me out. So let me pivot away from the impacts on inequality of this legislation and move to my analysis of its politics. So very quickly, we've looked at this together before. It's also going to worsen the food insecurity epidemic in the United States. We're up to a place where 20% of Americans rely on some form of charity, a food pantry, a church, etc., in order to get their food. And this is going to significantly reduce the federal subsidies for nutrition assistance, especially for children. Again, the idea that 20 million children are going to lose their nutrition assistance is just something that I find just heartbreaking about the consequence of this legislation. I won't go into the environmental stuff right now. I want to go into the analysis of the politics in terms of class and status. And in so doing, I'm going to start with a simple observation, right? Donald Trump has ascended, and the MAGA form of Republican politics, Make America Great Again, which is in part simply about supporting Donald Trump, but also about shifting the agenda of the Republican Party, the issues that it cares most about, to tariffs, right? Because we're being screwed by the rest of the world, right? To deportation because immigrants are taking your jobs, right? And the idea that this legislation fits that politics. It's a peculiar amalgam of old-fashioned Republican politics, cut taxes on the better off, and hopefully it will trickle down to everyone else. I think this has been disproved by years of actual experience, but also then the new identity politics, which is a nativist politics, which is a politics that fans the flames of white identity resentment. And so we see this, right, that the people who Trump did best with in terms of expanding the base of the Republican Party when he's on the ballot is people who earn $100,000 a year or less, especially people who earn $70,000 a year or less. And again, the people who really shifted from the Democrats to the Republicans in the Trump era are the people without college educations. There's a very strong overlap between these groups. And then I want to bring in particular, the analysis of Arlie Russell Hochschild, who I've spoken with you about before, and her book, Strangers in Their Own Land, but also her new book, Stolen Pride, Loss, Shame, and the Rise of the Right. And here, just to be direct, and let me shift now into a little bit of a summary of the points Hochschild makes and a connection of them to some themes in American politics. What Hochschild emphasizes is that as we've become a more unequal society, as precariousness, vulnerability has spread among people who believed that until quite recently, until we started to transition to a post-industrial and a neoliberal economy, they were on the way to secure middle-class existence, and now they believe that prosperity is out of reach and that their future and their children's future looks more like sustained downward mobility than moving up into the middle class. That these people are not just angry about loss of income, that what matters more to them is the loss of dignity, the loss of sense of belonging, the loss of equality, not in terms of exclusively economic standing, but in terms of social standing, in terms of what they think it reveals about what powerful people think about them, that they're not doing anything to reverse their downward mobility, that they are gaining at the expense. The rich are gaining at the expense of the middle class and the poor, and they want their pride back. They want their standing back. They want a form of politics that recognizes their suffering and that gives expression to their anger, to their sense of grievance about it. And frankly, Donald Trump does that much better than the Democrats do, even at the same time that he is exacerbating the suffering that results from growing precariousness and increased inequality. Which one of these things will matter most, right? That Donald Trump cut your Medicaid and SNAP benefits, or that Donald Trump seems to genuinely understand your rage at your loss of sense of belonging and dignity within this society. And I think Donald Trump is betting that the identification with him as a vehicle for taking revenge at the elites for their misplaced priorities, for their indifference to average Americans, that is going to be more important than the fact that his bill actually hurts people, right? And so the idea that this has been manifest in voting in poor states for much of the 21st century, that the poor states in the United States have voted in politicians who scale back their Medicaid benefits, who scale back their nutritional assistance benefits, who scale back their unemployment benefits, right, is a clear trend in American politics. It's especially clear in Kentucky. The more the denizens of Kentucky have come to rely on federal benefits, the more conservative the politicians they elect have become. And by the way, there seems to be a really clear explanation for this, which figures large in Hochschild's writing, as well as in other political scientists looking at this, and it has to do with the intersection of race and class. That a large portion of the white middle class has fallen out of the middle class, and that this has occurred at the same time that a Black and Latino middle class and elite have emerged, have led many white people who are in the bottom of the economic ladder to believe that the government has abandoned them at the same time that it's begun to lift up the Black, the Latino, the immigrant, the people who they think of as, or have been led to think of as, indirect competition with them, right? And so I think this is a really interesting analysis, right? If you look at the ratio or the level of economic peril as opposed to the level of racial resentment, it turns out that higher levels of racial resentment more than offset economic peril in predicting support for government services, right? People who have high levels of racial resentment don't want more welfare, don't want more Medicaid, don't want more supplemental nutrition assistance if they view those programs as primarily benefiting deserving racial minorities. And again, I think this is part of the politics of this bill. So to sum things up, right, we are in a moment where there is a lot of anger and resentment in our politics, and a fair bit of it is coming, frankly, from white voters who vote dominantly for Donald Trump, from less educated voters, from poorer voters. And I think one of the things that Hochschild helps us to see is that these people are not making stupid, self-damaging, self-destructive decisions when they support Donald Trump, when they support MAGA, maybe when they continue to support them even after they pass the big, beautiful bill that cuts their benefits and makes them still more precarious. Why? Why is that not just a stupid, self-injuring thing to do? If Donald Trump and the Republican politicians in the MAGA coalition make you feel felt, heard, recognized, make you feel as if you still are a full and equal member of this society, as if you belong to this society, that may be more valuable to you than the benefits you get from the government. I'm not saying that that is right. And by the way, if you lose your chemotherapy in order to gain your dignity, well, that is a strange trade-off, isn't it? But I am saying we should be careful in thinking that this politics makes no sense, that the Republicans just, signed a suicide pact or walked off a cliff together. I think we should be very careful to recognize that there is a logic to this politics that has benefited the Republican coalition up until this point and may continue to benefit them. The terrible damage the big beautiful bill is going to do notwithstanding. I'll stop there. I imagine I made a kind of complex argument with you today, both analysis of the big beautiful bill, analysis of its politics governed and dominated by a president, and analysis as well of the way in which a kind of politics of resentment, of growing inequality, actually feeds the support of Donald Trump, even when he is doing things to exacerbate that inequality. David, go ahead. You got to unmute. I muted you because we were getting some feedback.
Yeah, I just wanted to suggest that it seems to me that the only way out of this is to find a narrative in which any given individual's personal prosperity is not a zero-sum game. That is, the only way I can get ahead is if someone else falls behind. And it seems to me that that's implicit in the assumptions of the poor white narrative that I've forgotten her name, writes about.
Marley Russell Hochschild.
Yeah. But yesterday I read a review of Ezra Klein's new book on prosperity, the politics of abundance. And I haven't read it yet, but I did order it, and I want to look at it because it seems to me that maybe abundance for all is the way out of this predicament we find ourselves in. And I don't know, but somehow the Democrats have got to have a policy that suggests that your prosperity doesn't have to come at my decrement in prosperity.
I'm going for the book David is talking about. David, I'm going to mute you now. You can mute yourself whenever you want. Where is he? David, can you mute yourself?
I muted myself, but stop.
Okay, I got you muted. Sorry to cut you off. But this is a book by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson called Abundance. And it's a policy program for the Democratic Party. And the suggestion of the book is essentially that we have given up, the Democrats have given up on an economy that produces an abundant supply of the goods that people need in order to be middle class. So housing would be a really clear example of this. We need more housing and more housing closer to where the jobs are. Another example of this would be healthcare, right? We need to provide more healthcare at a more affordable rate. A third example of this would be education. If we are an information society and economy, then we need more people with a higher education so that they can have genuine opportunity. That in the middle of the 20th century, our society was actually committed to producing these goods, and it's part of the reason that the middle class grew so rapidly in the middle of the 20th century, and we need to get back to the politics of abundance, that's the right program for the Democratic Party to embrace going forward. And I want to say I don't have any disagreements with the agenda. And on the other hand, I don't think it really addresses the problem, right? The problem is not only that we have an affordability crisis because we don't provide or we don't supply, or our economy doesn't generate enough affordable housing. It is that our economy has become increasingly oligarchic and our politics have become increasingly oligarchic. There's a power dimension to this and not just a supply dimension to this. And frankly, we need to be doing the opposite of what the big, beautiful bill is doing. We need to be taxing the wealthy and corporations more, and we need to be using that revenue to provide greater security and opportunity for the bottom half of our society. Soon I will start thinking about speaking with you again about our artificial intelligence. And I think one of the things we're noticing in 2024, 2025, as the economy really has started to recover from COVID, is that actually there's a growing rate of unemployment among well-educated young people, people with a college degree, right? And the issue is that artificial intelligence and automation is taking the jobs they used to get, right? And this is going to get worse, not better, and building a lot more housing is going to help the people who have decent jobs. It's not going to help the people who don't. We need to do both of those things at the same time. So yeah, David, thank you for calling that to our attention. By the way, as you can see, it's on my to-read stack right now as well. I plan on speaking with you in more detail about this book in the not-too-distant future. John, it's been a while. Please go ahead. You have to unmute yourself, right? Got to hold down. There you go.
Thank you very much. I got it. This is actually just a footnote to your earlier talk about the Medicaid cutbacks, but I've just been reading an interview I'll send to everybody on our email group between Paul Krugman and Grubman, the best kind of political health economist around. But talking, the way that they're doing the Medicaid cutbacks is basically by increasing the paperwork that will take it beyond, so that the people that basically mostly need Medicaid, particularly the younger people, simply will not have the ability to deal with filling out a whole bunch of complicated forms every 6 months. And not only that, the cutbacks in the white collar government workforce has been so great that there aren't enough people in the government to actually read the reports, read the forms, and say that whether they're okay or not. And so there, it's really grim. It's really a cutback by I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it's just making making life more difficult for everybody as well as cutting back the money.
Yeah, thank you, John. And I did try to emphasize this aspect of it as well, that a lot of the people who are going to lose their benefits are actually people who are qualified for the benefits,
Yeah.
right? They're working, and they're still poor. And so they are exactly the people who should be getting Medicare. But having said that, there's what in the literature I read is called a time tax, right? You have to spend 10 hours every 6 months filling out paperwork. The paperwork has to be signed by your employer. It has to go through the right processes, right? And by the way, a lot of people are not going to notice, right, every 6 months when the deadline comes through, or are going to be working too hard to have the time to fill out the onerous paperwork. And so they're going to lose benefits they're qualified for. Right. I mean,
And
I
of
think
course,
the
all
other
these red
thing.
state people.
Go ahead,
Of
John.
course, all these red state people are also going to lose all their hospitals because Medicaid revenues will go down so much that hospitals won't be able to survive.
Yeah, you have a lot of states where 50% of the revenue at a hospital or a clinic comes from Medicaid reimbursement, right? And
Right.
so, say 20% of those people lose their Medicaid, right? 20% of the hospital's revenue goes away. Say 10% of that 20% still go to the hospital when they have a medical emergency. The ambulance pulls up because they're having a heart attack. They have some injury on the job. The hospital has to provide the services, but the person no longer has Medicaid, can't afford the bill, right? And so the hospital is not only not getting the revenue, it's still providing a portion of the services. It's really going to be in trouble very quickly, right? And so, by the way, you may have seen there's stuff in this bill also about not allowing Medicaid to go to Planned Parenthood clinics that provide abortions for non-abortion services, right? And so again, this is going to mean that clinics that do things like mammograms and other forms of cancer screening, providing birth control, are not going to be able to operate in areas that they're currently operating. Yeah, it's going to create a real increase in suffering in this country. David's quipping in the chat, we need AI to fill out these benefits for us. And we talk about together what are the kinds of things that we can be doing to address this. And I don't know what kinds of organizations will start providing these services and whether or not we can together find them and call them to each other's attention. But will there be community-based organizations that start assisting poor working people in making sure that they actually fill out their Medicare eligibility paperwork, which has just become much more onerous and much more difficult to do. And if you make a mistake, by the way, one of the things that this legislation does is it penalizes states who have beneficiaries who are not qualified, right? And so the states are going to become much more skeptical in their evaluation of the paperwork. Can community-based organizations start to intervene and help people to fill out this paperwork? Could they do so in a way that also says to them, by the way, you shouldn't have to do this, and what it means to live in a society that experiences and manifests solidarity is not to cut benefits in these ways, but instead to provide benefits for everyone. And I don't know, but again, I like trying to look for the opportunities to do things better in these bad bills, I think this is a place where maybe we're going to have to be on the lookout for people organizing to assist the people who are going to be in harm's way because of this bill.
Yeah.
Yeah, Barbara, go ahead. Were you raising your hand? Go ahead.
Yeah.
You're unmuted.
I'm trying. Okay. Just listening to us even this morning, I think.
No, now you just muted. Now you're good. Go
Okay.
ahead.
It shows muted on my screen. Sorry. A place to start is amongst the Democrats, amongst those of us who think we understand this now. We've got an attitude shift ourselves that we need to do. We cannot keep thinking, oh, they don't have the time, they don't understand how to do the paperwork. I mean, we have to eat some humble pie too.
Yeah,
I really think.
Well, and Barbara,
and that flows backwards into education. Our pride in the wonderful education that we received, whether we're happy and thrilled because we had wonderful elementary school educations all the way through, whether it was state school or whatever, and whether we became professors or didn't become professors, we can't lord it over other people, and we can't let our children do that.
yeah.
There has to be a shift within the elite of the Democratic Party, and not even the elite. I mean, we need to find not just pity, but compassion and actual ways to assist the understanding. Anyway, that's my.
Yeah, that's really, really important point, Barbara. Thank you. And I'm going to try to tie it back to what I've been saying to you today, which is we may be in a world where cultural politics matter more than material politics, where the sense that we're talking down to, or that we don't identify with, or that we don't care about, or that we don't see a certain category of Americans, right? And I'm being loose in referring to them as the white working class, but that the way they talk versus the way we talk suggests to them that we think because we're better educated, or because we are not financially insecure, that we're better than them. And so then let me amplify the point just for a second in a way that's a little bit different than the way you spoke about it. You spoke about it in terms of education, but the kinds of issues that we care about. And so there's been genuine and I think very important outrage at the way in which immigration customs enforcement is going after people who are here without authorization, but who have no criminal record, and in fact are vital to our economy. And I agree with this outrage. I think in particular that we need a richer conception of our society, right? If we depend on these people's work to get our groceries to our table, if we depend on these people's work to provide our health care or other essential services, then we shouldn't be deporting them, right? We should be actually creating pathways for their full inclusion in our society. But having said that, if we don't show equal outrage about the loss of Medicaid benefits or growing inequality, it makes it look like we care more about a subset of the vulnerable population than we do about this large group of people who are suffering downward mobility, increased precariousness, and loss of pride and dignity. Right, loss of sense that they fully belong in and are seen and respected within our politics. So yes, Barbara, I completely agree with that. And it's part of the reason I worry that the Republicans may not pay as much of a penalty for their betrayal of their own voters as they should. If the Democrats can't figure out how to begin to talk again to ordinary people in a way that doesn't sound condescending, and how to frame their issues in a way that is more inclusive. Yeah, perfect, Barbara. Thank you so much. Anybody else with a point for today?
I can't be seen. Can you hear me?
I can hear you,
Yeah.
Iris. Go ahead.
I can't find the right switches. I'd like to point out that the economy is going to make a huge difference in how Republicans survive this. If we lose the borrowers of our economy, who don't feel we are running a very good ship at this point, they aren't going to buy our salesmanship about how wonderful we are, how trustworthy. They're going to stay away.
Oh,
and
yeah.
if they don't buy our what is it they have to buy?
The
They don't
Treasury
have to
bonds.
buy our treasury bonds. Thank you.
You bet.
What we survive on, I think the Republicans are going to have an ill educated and unhappy electorate that will not suffice to sustain our economic growth in a healthy way. And I think our economic policies are going to undermine our ability to sell our bonds and our future sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Iris. And I think not only are you right, I think there are growing signs that this is happening already, right? The dollar has had its worst 6 months in the last 20 years, right? And that's a kind of referendum on confidence in American leadership and American policy. The interest rates on Treasury bonds are going up because people are not confident that our government is serious about paying it off, or that the long-term effects of the policies that we're passing are going to put us in a position to actually continue to grow and sustain a consumer-based economy. Yeah, I think you're 100% right, Iris. Thank you for the good comment. Anybody else? All right, I'm going to wish you all well. We will have more to talk about. I did pivot the conversation away from the Supreme Court and into the big beautiful bill because the big beautiful bill just passed. I think if nothing else big comes up, we will spend next week talking about the Supreme Court, as I had promised for this week. Be well, take care, and see everybody next Saturday. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thank you, David.
My pleasure as always. Thanks for the good comments. Bye-bye.